Welcome, everyone. You're listening to The Last Dinosaur, and I'm your host, Chris Aversano. This is the podcast where we explore the evolving maritime landscape and hear from innovators leading the charge. Today's guest is Jason Lloyd, Senior Executive at TotalTek, a company pushing the boundaries in how we think about shipyard operations. Jason brings over 35 years of leadership across operations, engineering, and acquisition. All of this forged in the U.S. Navy's nuclear power program. But what caught my attention about this? TotalTek isn't talking about innovation. They're doing something about it, and more importantly, helping their clients and the industry in that way. One of the bold moves, enabling their clients to embrace remote work in roles once considered untouchable by flexibility, such as ship designers and engineers. Jason, welcome to The Last Dinosaur.
Thank you, Chris, for having me. It's a real honor to be here.
Yeah, this is really interesting because when I first heard about this, I was like, okay, shipyards just kind of getting into the limelight. We'll talk about that a little bit, especially here in the U.S. But my question is, before we get into kind of the meat potatoes, and hopefully we'll end with that, is how did somebody go from Navy nuclear, really rigorous program, a lot of training in a very specific part of the Navy and defense industry into reinvent yourself into shipyard work and dealing with shipyards?
Yeah. Hey, thanks, Chris. Most of it came from my experience in the Navy. So as an operator, I was naval nuclear power and ships. But what I did all the rest of the time in Navy was trying to figure out the ship acquisition process, shipbuilding process, and ship repair process. So I did a whole lot of shipbuilding from the government side of the house during that time frame. And what I got into it really is when I was in the Navy, probably my last 10 years, probably from 2012 to 12 years, 24, really focusing on a problem that we are being overrun in the shipbuilding era. Any idea how many ships America builds per year, commercial and military, Chris?
I would say 36.
Okay, that's not a bad guess. About 12 right now is how many military and commercial we build a year. And then I won't play Stump the Chump with you, but right now China's building up about 1,700 per year.
Yeah.
12, right? And it's amazing that we got here because during World War II, we built over 5,000 ships in a 4-year period. The Liberty ships were a real big one. We built 2,700 Liberty ships. And the fastest build that we had was laying a keel to delivery of a Liberty ship in 4 days and 15 hours. Pretty amazing. But then we had a decline. What happened is over the years, whenever you stopped building military ships, you would switch over to building commercial ships. And so you would maintain that industrial workforce of welders, electricians, ship designers, all those people who are, it's not a science, it's an art to be able to do all those things. And so we kind of maintain that workforce as we shifted between military buildups and military declines. In 1981, we had a really big moment where the Reagan administration decided to modify the Merchant Marine Act of 1936 to stop subsidizing commercial shipbuilding. And commercial shipbuilding ground to a halt in the United States because we couldn't compete with other countries that did subsidize that shipbuilding. But it didn't become really apparent because we were building up to a 600-ship Navy in the Reagan administration, right? And so all those resources were needed for the military shipbuilding. And then in 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell and the Cold War ended, we stopped military shipbuilding. So now you've got
and the peace dividend, right? That was always the peace dividend, which was going to be fewer wars, less money on that, and more money on other.
Yeah. You're exactly right. And when you're not looking long term, when you're looking at the immediate problem, that's probably the right thing to do. But when we stopped that shipbuilding, we lost the maritime industrial superiority that we had since World War II, right? Because you stopped both of them. And I think nobody really understood. I've gone back and read articles from 89 where people did recognize that this could be a problem. I mean, going back, it's hard to find articles from 89 because the internet wasn't that big, but I found copies of paper articles where some people predicted this was going to happen. But we really lost that superiority. And in the Navy, we realized it probably around the 2012 timeframe when we started trying to build back up because we saw what China was doing. We saw Russia was coming back. And so we started trying to rebuild up that Navy, and we just couldn't do it. I mean, we absolutely fell on our face. And it wasn't through anybody's lack of trying. It's just that those electricians, those welders, they moved on. They did other things, right? And you don't just reestablish that industrial base that you've let go of. And so I worked on that my last 4 years in the maritime industrial base with people like Matt Sermon and Whitney Jones, and trying to reinvigorate. How do you make blue collar work sexy again, right? How do you get the blue collar workforce out there again? How do you get advanced manufacturing methods such as additive manufacturing, cold spray, and those things out there to replace more traditional things like forging and casting? And how do you get what we call the new collar workforce, the people who operate those new technologies? How do you get them back into it so we can focus again and rebuild our maritime capacity and maritime industrial base? And so that's what really got me interested in this. And then I retired. I retired in June and came back out to work. Long story, coming to work for TotalTek. But the CEO here basically said, hey, you've given it the time trying to work on it from the government side. You got a great perspective. How about coming over here and trying to work on it from the private sector side? And I said, okay, what is it that you do? And he said, maritime engineering and design. I said, okay, great. And that really got me focused in on ship designers and ship engineers when I started this job in July of last year. And I realized, holy moly, we've got the same problem with ship designers, maritime designers, and engineers that we've got with the blue-collar workforce of welders and electricians. We're not growing new ones. We're taking the same ones that we got now, and they're circulating between the different shipyards, but they're going to gradually retire. And if we don't get out in front of this, we're going to lose the capacity to build and design ships. And then your lack of electricians and welders really doesn't matter, right? If it's leading edge, you can't build them and design them. And so that's what I've been trying to work on here at TotalTek, which led to, a remote design workforce discussion.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I was at a conference at the end of last year, and they said the average age of a U.S. shipyard worker is something like 61 years old, right? And for all the reasons that you laid out, right? If you look at that kind of makes sense. People who kind of held on as you had the very slow decline in commercial and military ships, something like that does take a generation to really play out, right? Because that's basically what you're talking, almost 2 generations. It is playing out. And really, like you said, you kind of came in and the thing that was interesting in having you on the podcast is that you're approaching it differently and you're saying, okay, well, we need to evolve the model. I mean, when you go in and you talk to folks and you say, listen, we know what it is. We can't change these things. We want to consider doing some of these roles remotely, right? What's the reception when you speak to clients or potential clients? Because your role is to place, right? You guys act as a recruiter, right? That's pretty much what you do. So when you go in and suggest this, is that the right way to think about it? That you have to approach and say, hey guys, let's start to hire on a remote basis?
Well, so we're about half and half. We do some engineering placements, but the other half of us is completely remote engineering and design workforce. So we do full cradle to grave projects. What we found in the COVID era was COVID forced us into uncomfortably doing a lot of things that we had never done before, right? And one of the things was, how do we get everybody out of these dense population areas in a shipyard and get them away from each other, right, to see what we can efficiently do? And you got rid of a lot of those. And all of the shipyard designers all left, and because you could do the work remotely. And so they did the work remotely, and it worked in general. It does take a special kind of person to work remotely, right? You got to have integrity. You got to be internally driven. You got to have fun with your workmates, right? And those, to be honest with you, that's why I came to TotalTek, because their values matched my personal values. And I thought, all right, we got the same values here. Let's see what we can do with this. So after COVID went away, so during COVID, remote work was all the blaze, right? Everybody did it. After COVID went away, everybody swapped back over and said, all right, now everybody come back in to work. But there were a lot of lives that had changed in that point in time, that people had changed their lifestyles to work remotely. And they saw a lot of the advantages. If you're in a shipyard, typically, like I've been in them for my whole career, you're typically an hour into work, 45 minutes searching for a parking space, an hour back home. That's almost 3 hours out of your day that you're not getting compensated for. And suddenly this design workforce realized, holy crap, I can work my 8-hour day, or 12 if they want to, get overtime, spend time with family, spend time helping kids grow, that kind of stuff. And so this design workforce really said, hey, we can do this remotely. And so when the shipyards all went back to in-house, a lot of those designers said, no, I'd like to go work remotely. And TotalTek stepped into that area and said, all right, we'll go hire a lot of these people that want to do this, and we'll help the shipyards and we'll help the designers from a remote organization. It was really, and this was before I came aboard, but it was really a novel idea that, hey, let's take advantage of some of the advantages of remote work when it can be done remotely, and see if we can use those people to improve the workforce.
Yeah, I mean, obviously you can't have somebody welding a ship from, 150 miles away and, so on, right? Maybe you can robotically at some point, but somebody's going to still have to get hands on the ship. But what was the general reaction? Because, the interesting thing is we had this forced on us because of COVID, and I'm not saying it negatively. I'm saying it is what it is, right? You had that. And, I've seen some industries kind of revert right back. I think of, my old role as a shipbroker, and that kind of made a lot of sense because you have to kind of be in a room and you want to hear what somebody else talk about. Although there are some successful companies that have microphones and they make you keep an open mic, and it kind of works. And maybe it's not necessarily fully remote, but you could definitely do something hybrid. Are there people who still insist 100%, or is management starting to look at this as, I have to move off the mark because of what I said earlier, the average age is 61 years old, and there's no way we're going to attract and retain talent. We're competing against other companies that do give flexible work, whether it's fully remote or hybrid. Walk us through kind of what you've seen and the reaction from the clients and partners that you're dealing with. Because I think this is the most interesting thing, because I think this is, as a holistically, as an industry, with the exception of actually mariners who eat more of the ship and things like that, there's going to be a lot of things that you could easily take remote. I've been working remote for 5+ years and have very little problems with it. And I'll argue all the strengths that you just argued: flexibility, schedule, being able to put out fires at home, but being completely dedicated and not really missing a beat because of that. So talk us through about what did you see and kind of and the reaction from senior management when you start to engage in these ideas.
Yeah, so one of my favorite quotes, Chris, is if you don't like change, you're going to like irrelevance even less.
Yeah.
As the world changes with us, we got to figure out how to change with it in order to continue to be the best. And so it's one of the mantras I always go into when I think about these things. And so I'll be honest with you, I was one of those curmudgeons that did not believe in remote work. I just didn't believe in it at all. And when my CEO, Brock Bauer, who's the CEO of TotalTech, when he interviewed me, we went through about 6 interviews, and he offered me the job on the last interview. And I said, well, let me think about it. And he said, well, what do you need to think about? And I said, well, I'll be honest with you, I'm not sure that I believe in remote work. And he laughed and he said, well, that's going to be kind of hard to lead a remote workforce if you don't believe in remote work. And we laughed about it. And then he said, all right, he said, why don't you believe in remote work? And I said, I don't think you can ever have as efficient of a team if you don't have face-to-face interactions and you don't see the facial expressions and a lot of that stuff that you get information from that aren't just, verbal interactions. And he said, I agree with you. And I said, okay. And I thought I'd won at that point in time, and he said, but what if by offering remote work, I can get the best people in the right positions and together they're a little bit less efficient? Who's going to be more productive? And so he had just turned this into an engineering problem for me, And so I kind of thought about it and I laughed and I thought, yeah, I hear you, but I'm not sure I believe in it. And I hung up the phone And I went to my wife and she said, what happened? I said, well, he offered me the job. And I told her about the little challenge he did give me. And she laughed at me. And I said, what? And she said, well, you weren't going to take this job when you first found out it was in Wisconsin, were you? And suddenly I realized, holy moly, she just turned the tide on me, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, so can you get the right people in the right positions by working remotely?
Right.
And then he said, referring exactly to what you said, Chris, he said, we also have policies. He said, we have a policy that we always have cameras on. Your camera will always be on. If you're in a meeting, there's no excuse. You will be called out if your camera's not on.
Right.
And,
that's not.
Yep. And we have, I don't have it now because we're on Riverside, but if you're on with me on Teams, we all have TotalTek backgrounds. So you can't see my bike sitting in the back.
Yeah.
Walking behind me. Right. And so by policies, I think you can take care of a lot of those things where you may not be as efficient, but you may be more effective as a team. And so I use that instance to talk to people when they say, I don't believe in remote work. And I'm like, well, I think, like you said, some things can't be done remotely, but we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. We prove some things can be done remotely.
Absolutely.
And there are some people, we're not all the same. There are some people that need to be able to work remotely for whatever reason. Like for me, I took this job in Alexandria, Virginia 8 months ago, and I'm now living in Savannah, Georgia, able to take care of some family health problems because I'm allowed to remote work. And I've got story after story of my team on why they're a remote worker and why industry would not be able to get them in a job where they had to go into the office every day. So we're getting advantage of their skill sets by offering remote work.
Yeah, I think that's one of the real important things. I had a similar type thing here with the current job I'm in, and my boss sits in Canada, right? And he's like, well, you can go to an office, but it's not going to change anything. And I have a very specific job and I, am very outward facing in terms of the market. So, me sitting wherever kind of doesn't matter. I'd have to go into, travel to see clients, whatever, for the most part. It kind of doesn't matter. But I do think there's a lot of roles. And I want to speak about some, without jumping ahead, because I like to talk about this, but there's a lot of other positive reasons. But stepping aside for a second, when you talk to your clients, you kind of explain your journey, which is pretty cool, like from being a skeptic to realizing that, hey, you won't even be interviewing for this job if you had to, sit where the headquarters are in Wisconsin. Talk about some of the successes that you had, because we did speak earlier as we were kind of getting acclimated and I was learning about TotalTech. You're kind of starting a little bit of a program to kind of help engineers get their feet wet, almost get that kind of early experience, and then go out into the real world, even though the real world is still remote. Talk about that success, because I think that's kind of an interesting way of the way that you're approaching it, of being on the project side. So actually providing the folks, as well as being on the placement side, because it sounds like you're trying to maximize that all under the umbrella of remote work.
Yeah, Chris. So this has been thanks for asking. It's a great question. This has been a real journey for us. And I've done a lot of learning as we've gone on. When I came into the job, I realized that the typical shipyards, they don't want anybody who doesn't have 3 years of experience. And typically, from my experience, it usually takes about 3 years to get 3 years of experience. And so, you have a lot of community college graduates and the designers that don't have any experience. And so they're sitting there going like, how do I ever break into this workforce if I don't have the experience and it's a prerequisite for me to get into it? So I was finding that problem. And so we partnered with Gulf Coast Community College. And I said, hey, let me hire one of your designers and I'm going to develop a training program for that designer to get the experience. Won't get them 3 years, but to get them maritime designer experience, and then utilize them in less exquisite designer roles to get that experience working for customers. And so we hired our first one in January, a young lady named Brenda, just a firecracker. And she came in and we used her and some of my designers to develop a designer program using Ship Constructor, which is our software of choice. And we worked with her to give her that experience. Took about 4 months to develop the training program. After she was done with it, I went to one of our customers and I said, hey, I've got this designer level 1. You can use her. You can have her for a month for free. Just tell me what your experiences are. And so he said, great, I love free work. So he brought her on as a designer one and had her doing designer level one work, where typically we're using designer level fours because that's all we hire is people with experience. And so he used her for about a month. And then after the month, and he said, all right, I'm sold. What is the pay rate if I want to hire her? And I said, it's half the rate that you're paying for my experienced designers. And he said, I'll take her in a heartbeat. So she started there. So now we developed a program. So we advertised what this program is and said, hey, we can scale this. And we took that before the Maritime Industrial Base, which I mentioned earlier, and said, hey, if we want to invest in this, we can start up a school and start to give them that experience to transition them into experienced designers. One of the weaknesses that I found is you can never be a good designer, in my opinion. Other people may have other opinions, unless you've actually been on the deck plate, routing pipe, routing electrical cables, that kind of stuff. So my dream of building a completely remote designer workforce was kind of, I had to put that on the back burner and say, hey, these young designers are going to need to go into the shipyards for at least a couple of years of experience, because even though you may be able to route this pipe in this 3D product model, it fits in there. You can't weld that pipe on a ship because of the location of it. And you will never know that unless you've been in the shipyard to see it. And so I think I've learned a lot that you can't do it all remotely. It has to be done in a combination, but we can train them on the spot and then after a couple of years, transition them into being able to work remotely. So I've learned a lot in this path, and I think the team's learned a lot.
You get into now the whole idea of creating a pipeline. And like you said, you have this double-edged sword. I need 3-year experience for an entry-level job. How? Like, this is physically impossible, right? And you're kind of bridging that gap, which kind of gets to the other real kind of crux of the matter with the proposed CHIPS Act. And I'll say proposed because it's actually unique in that it's a bipartisan and bicameral approach, which we haven't seen in any legislation I can remember in a long time. And I was talking to somebody earlier, and he and I are around the same age, a couple of years older. And we both went to SUNY Maritime, and we were chatting. And I said, I don't remember this much excitement about the U.S. Merchant Marine in my entire 30 plus years being associated with the shipping industry, be it a sailor, chartering, whatever. I haven't really seen that. CHIPS Act, I think I was talking to somebody, it's about a third has to do with training, right? So 2/3 is the shipyards and how we're going to reinvigorate that. And about a third is the overall training. And this is everything from Kings Point to the state merchant schools to everybody. Talk a little bit about kind of the feedback you're getting on this from industry, your own thoughts, and really kind of how what you're doing and maybe others model it in the future, but this whole idea of remote work, how remote work and using digital tools can actually be additive to this and help solve the problem, right? Again, you're going to need welders to move to shipyards. That's what I'm saying. There's probably a fairly significant percentage roles that if you make it attractive enough that are going to be required if we even get a third of what the SHIP Act, like I'm talking like the SHIPS Act has a lot of support. Let's see what happens when it comes out of committee. Let's say it's a third, right? It's more money than we've seen in my lifetime.
Right.
So, but that's going to require workforce and it's going to require new ways of thinking. Talk a little bit about what you're hearing from internal to what your company's thinking about, where you can, and then your clients and other people who are starting to realize, like, if this goes through, we have a positive problem, I think.
It's a great time to be involved in the maritime industry. And I agree with you, being able to see everybody to recognize the problem. That's the hardest part, right? And that's why it's the first step in Alcoholics Anonymous is recognizing I have a problem, right? And then solving it. And so I think we at least recognize that we have a problem that we have to go solve. And we as Americans have to do that. We as a team have to go do that. We have to embrace all those new skill sets that you talked about, the training, getting them in there. We have to embrace, I mentioned it earlier, but advanced manufacturing methods, additive manufacturing, cold spray. The last time in my research that we had a major technology breakthrough that rapidly accelerated shipbuilding was when we started the Liberty Ship program, and that was welding vice riveting of ships. right? We could produce ships 20 times faster by welding instead of riveting. But it required a recognition that we've got a problem, right? We have to go do something differently. And we did. We welded ships instead of riveting them. Now, that led to a lot of learning. I don't know if you read a lot on the Liberty Ship program, but we had Liberty ships that were cracking in half at the pier. They would just completely crack in half sitting pierside. And so everybody started going, well, why is that? They couldn't have reached the yield stress. We recognized what brittle fracture was out of the Liberty program. We recognized a new method of failure, and then we designed against it. We talked about nuclear power. That is one of the prime things that we're trained on in nuclear power is brittle fracture, because a very thick component is a reactor vessel that has rapid heating and cool down, rapid pressurizes, right? And so brittle fracture really led to the basics of the naval nuclear power program. So we learned a lot from that. We failed some. And so we have to recognize through additive and different manufacturing methods, yes, if we wait and prove out every bit of those, it's going to take 15 years. And we don't have 15 years. We got to go take some risks on components that are, if they fail, nobody's going to get hurt or killed, but we can learn from them, right? Or we can operationally test them as SAT. Much like you look at Elon Musk's space program, right? They fail. Now, nobody's on the rocket, so it's a money situation if you fail. But you rapidly learn that way, right? And so I think that's the big thing that we have to do as America is push the envelope with these new advanced manufacturing methods and getting people excited. If you go out to Danville, Virginia, the Navy's got a facility out there that they are sending tons and tons of people to. I mentioned the new collar workforce. They're training them to operate CNC machines, to operate additive manufacturing machines, all of those things so that we can accelerate technology, accelerate more people wanting to get into it and get excited about building in the Navy.
One of the interesting things is that I don't think we talk enough about with remote work, because I think that remote work, I always feel we talk about things like, okay, maybe you could do a hybrid. You work in the Philly yard or Philly yards, and you could live kind of a couple hours away. But I also think that there's a wonderful opportunity to really extend the maritime business into places like the middle of Iowa. I'm not picking on anybody who's listening from Iowa, which I don't think there may be anybody, or Colorado, maybe somebody that had some experience or some interest, and due to family issues, his wife or spouse got a great job and they got to move away from kind of their job in design or shipyard. But now you have this opportunity to maybe try something different or continue a role that otherwise they would have had to give up. And I think that that's one of the most important parts of this remote work, which will also hopefully get different views on problem solving, right? And I think one of the problems that I bet shipyards run into, and let me know what you think, is that it sounds like you get a lot of recycled people. Like you may start as a designer 3 in shipyard A, then maybe move to designer 4, but maybe you move up to the next level, but you got to leave the shipyard, which is typical of companies, right? Like, oh, I got promoted from associate product manager to product manager here, but they're not going to make me senior, but I got a way bigger job and I got to go jump over there. It sounds like you're getting a lot of recycled people, not in a bad way, because it was always a small or contracting industry. Now you have a chance to kind of bring in different outside influences that may be able to tackle problems that, you didn't think about as a typical maritime person, right? I mean, I would imagine that that's also some of the positives that you're looking for when you talk about remote work.
Absolutely. In fact, I can't say it. Well, by the time this comes out, she'll be probably working for us, but I'm going to extend out a job offer today to somebody who's all their experiences in the oil and gas industry. And that's where they worked, and they've never been in an area where they could do maritime design, but great attitude, has the core values of the company, which I think is 60% of the whole issue is having the core values of being internally driven, integrity, and all those things. And she just wants to come work. And so we can take advantage of that. And we can go through the training program, and I can take anybody who's a good designer and give them the maritime experience. Whereas you probably wouldn't be able to get that individual because she lives in the middle of Texas, and you're not going to get a maritime designer in the middle of Texas. I got a real quick, but I got another one that when I first came in, I did an interview with all the designers. And the first one I met, they said, "This is one of your best designers." And so I talked to him on the phone. I said, "Hey, Josh, where do you live?" And he said, "San Diego right now." And I said, "What do you mean right now?" He said, "Well, next week we're moving to Hawaii." And I said, "Oh," I said, "Did you buy a house there? That's a pretty big move." And he said, "No," he said, "I've been working for TotalTech for 2 years now." He said, "My wife and I decided to sell our house and become Gold Star members of TrustedHouseSitters.com. And we travel the world, staying in mansions for free, house sitting the dogs for rich people. And I work a full-time job, and we just travel the world." And I thought, how do you get that in here? I think the opportunities, Chris, are just there. And you think about that and you think, wow. And he's one of my best designers.
And this is from your kind of consulting side, project side of the business, right? So this is the placement side, but this is how you're approaching it. You're like, yeah, this is okay, dude. Like, they call that nomad, right? Nomad working. A lot of people did that during COVID. I'm going to go drive cross country and spend 2 weeks in Yosemite and then slide down to, some other state park or federal park. Yeah.
So that was really exciting to me to realize, have we even begun to scratch the surface of harnessing the minds and the design aspects of all of the United States? It just opens up, like you mentioned, so many other options.
So many. And then you take that model and you put it with a global aspect to it, right? Like if you're talking about shipyards or just maritime work in general, you could take a person who is motivated, who aligns with whatever your company's value are in the middle of Africa, right? Central America, Central Asia, doesn't matter. They got education. They want to, for whatever reason, they're close. Maybe it's close to the university, maybe close to their family. But if you have this person and you get this person motivated, he or she, you get them motivated to work, right? And work for you. And your goal happens to be building ships. Okay. Like, who cares? Like that's fine. The maritime industry has a huge problem of being invisible, of sea blindness. People don't know how they get their goods to their door. And I think that this is an interesting way to start to peel back the layers. Certainly.
Yeah, absolutely.
As we wrap up, I love to ask this question. So not sure how much traveling. You said you're down kind of working remotely, dealing with some family health issues. What are you reading these days? Are you reading anything specific about business and the idea of remote work? Are you reading something more fun about things like science fiction or other things?
Great question, Chris. So, the new book I'm reading, I've always got 3 books sitting around. 2 of them I'm reading over and over again because I just keep getting more and more information every time I read them. Those 2 are, the first one is Freedom's Forge by Arthur Herman, on how we transformed the American industrial base to win World War II. I mean, it wasn't in maritime only. It was in building airplanes. It was everything. And it was the American industry that did it. American industry that enabled us to produce the weapons, number one, that kept England in the war long enough to allow us to come in, right? And then to ultimately win. It was the fact that Germany stayed with the artisan production and we switched to mass manufacturing. It was that one switch that allowed, in my opinion, our industrial base to really overcome. And so that one I keep getting great lessons out of, because if we did it before, how do we do it again, And then the second one is more advanced to the day, and it's written by Christian Bros. It's called The Kill Chain. And it's really about how the current way of buying naval weapon ships, all those things, is tailored to a different era. And that we've got to change that part of it into how we acquire ships and weapons and those kind of things. And it's a really, really good book. Christian was the chief of staff for John McCain during his time, and he really had a unique view of, what we call the China problem and the Russia problem. So those 2 are the ones that I go back to And then the third one I'm reading is a business one, and it's called What Your CEO Wants You to Know. And the reason I'm reading that is because I come from a government background. I didn't know what a profit and loss statement was when I came into the shop. And now I'm running operations for the company, right? And so I have to know what profit and loss is. I have to know revenue and profit, and where you trade off those two, and getting revenue and new business and making sure you make a profit. And so I'm really reading that now and learning a lot more about the business side of the house, which I had zero experience in. And the boss graciously allowed me to learn as we go.
Those sound like three relevant and interesting reads. Jason, thank you for coming on the podcast. This was really interesting because I appreciated your exploration of the space of remote work, because even though you're reading a lot about now, many of the banks are going to move back, we have to go back. And my guess is because they own the real estate and they want the real estate to be profitable, but we'll just leave it. We'll just leave that there. That's my guess, because I don't really see it being a productivity issue. All the reports that you read is a productivity remains solid, if not goes up, for a lot of the reasons that you laid out, especially flexibility and less travel time. I mean, the scenario that you laid out of 2 to 2.5 hours of junk time traveling and parking spot looking can be used either for personal gain, whether it's going to the gym or spending time with the family, or even actually overtime. I'm excited to hear what's going on and would love to see if this is replicated throughout the globe in other parts of the maritime industrial base. Jason, thank you for coming on. I do appreciate it. I learned a lot today.
Chris, thanks for having me. I learned a lot too, and now I know you're a SUNY graduate. I'm going to come after and see if we can get some advice from you in this area.
Absolutely. Yeah. I got plenty of people we can put you in touch with. Thanks again, Jason. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Chris. Have a great day.